event today on 90% of the city supply energy consumption generation right now comes from large hydroelectric dams, but the ability to expand hydro is limited by social and environmental concerns and some resource constraints and climate change vulnerability. So the region is expected to see a substantial increase in electricity generation from natural gas and from non-conventional renewables, which are basically wind, solar, geothermal. Moving towards zero carbon electricity sources is critical not only to decarbonizing the power sector, but also to allow for the decarbonization of the transportation sector through electric vehicles. Non-conventional renewables are increasingly competitive with fossil fuels, and they have reached grid parity in many markets. But natural gas also remains a more affordable and reliable source in many cases. So therefore, there's a debate going on in a lot of countries about what the optimal mix is to provide reliable, affordable, and clean energy, and how to move towards full decarbonization. So today, we organized this event around a study that Walter Vergara from the World Resources Institute has done. He's going to present his findings on how to. I think we can just stay seated.
WRI is of immense. Before we get into discussion, the first point, 10% of the third, very important, of the passenger train. With first one, I'd like to talk the peninsula, the nominal power, wind, solar, biomass for Latin America, and the total, according to their estimate, is about 100 petawatt hours. Put that in the context that the total power is 20 petawatt hours, and you see here a size of the potential of Latin America. It could, the endowment, they are there. The system is not as high as it could be. So just a few days back, the Pacific Alliance, the countries from Colombia down to Chile, have agreed to consider an integrated sub-regional carbon market. And that's also going in the right direction. The third point of relevance is the fact that technology is moving very fast, and consequently, the generation costs are falling. This is data from IRENA, and it shows the composite of generation costs of actual plants, how it has moved from 2010 to 2014 in just a few years. It shows the trend, most of the renewable resources falling rapidly. On the right panel, you see the relative position in LCOEs, levelized cost of electricity of Latin America compared to other countries for renewable resources. See Latin America very well positioned. So we have estimated the levelized cost of electricity for renewables for the Latin American context, taking into account current costs, and you see them there compared with the levelized cost of electricity of combined cycle natural gas. This is a very important point because as Lisa has indicated, the policy debate today is, well, what do we do with natural gas? If you believe in the markets, forget about natural gas. Go for renewables. Today, they are very competitive and they will become even more competitive in the future. So to all the policymakers that are still thinking about promoting natural gas, I say abandon those efforts. If you look into the future, we have a picture like this. We have on the left panel the learning curves calculated for different renewable resources in Latin America, and you see them, according to our estimates, the learning curves are all pointing down. You see some horizontal bars, and they refer to natural gas, to coal, and to diesel at different values. And you can deduct a number of conclusions there, but in general, you can say, as a blanket statement, that renewable energy is going to win the field, just on straight economics. On the right panel, I have included the estimates of levelized cost of energy, learning curves for 3 technologies. Now, if you imagine a horizontal line at 0.11, that would be in dollars per kilowatt hour, the levelized cost for combined cycle natural gas, you can see that again, for individual renewable energy resources, the learning curves indicate that renewable energies are very competitive today, some more than others, and will become even more so in the future. So you can imagine a pathway to zero carbon in Latin America, and we've made that exercise. It's a thought experiment. Let's assume that all new demand is met by renewables by 2020. And this is not impossible to achieve. It can be done. Let's assume then that fossil plants other than gas are mothballed by 2030, that essentially diesel, oil, and coal is mothballed by 2030, that all natural gas plants, let's not entertain more natural gas plants in Latin America, that all are mothballed by 2050, and that the grid is integrated by 2030, with widespread distributed power available also by 2030. And this is the curves that you get. And you get zero. It can be done. Of course, this is not easy. There are a number of barriers, but I'm happy to report that the barriers are not economics, the barriers are not technology, the barriers are not resources, the barriers are not trends. There are some entrenched interests that are preventing faster progress. And we have to be honest with ourselves. There are fossil fuel subsidies that exist in Latin America. They are entrenched, and it will be very difficult to lift them, but we need to. There is not a carbon dioxide market today in the region. The grid integration is not a reality today, and there is no regional carbon market. If all those four barriers could be lifted, the transition to zero carbon future will be much easier. I want to highlight the issue of the interconnected regional grid. You remember the graph that I showed you with the location of all the multi-annual reservoirs of hydro. If we have a regional grid in Latin America, at least in South America, it would be feasible to allow all large reservoirs of renewable energy to access the regional market. It would be feasible to dampen the intermittencies of local renewable resources. It would be feasible to allow regional multi-annual reservoirs to operate as a large energy storage facility. Let's imagine that Colombia is experiencing a drought, but Ecuador is wet as today. Well, they could operate this large regional 0.1 terawatt battery to supply the demand and reduce power costs. Let me finalize by pointing to transport. As Lisa indicated, this is a very important factor in the total demand for power for energy in Latin America. These are the model shares of urban transport of some cities in Latin America, Bogotá and Curitiba, compared with Berlin and Copenhagen and the average city in the United States. And you can see that cities in Latin America are not that bad to start with in terms of carbon footprint. A significant fraction, almost half of the total passenger trips of the modal transport share is taken by bus, that is a multi-passenger vehicle that reduces the carbon footprint and that eases the transition to an electric transport system. So it is important to identify a number of synergies between low carbon power and electric transport. These are two technologies that are moving in tandem. The renewable energy cost is falling, PV's facilities are falling, the market share of PV is increasing rapidly, storage costs are falling down, the cost of electric vehicles is coming down. Probably many of you read yesterday that Volvo announced that by 2020 they will not produce any more purely internal combustion engine vehicles. That's fantastic, that's the direction. And the wireless stations, charging stations are emerging. That technology is becoming very economically attractive. This is the continuation of a historical trend, and I have here some data that has been compiled by a university in Australia. And you see in the upper panel dollars per kilowatt hour for the cost of lithium battery packs. On the lower left, the falling prices for batteries coming down very rapidly, and the improvement in energy densities. This will not stop. And I want you to focus on the fact that last year Tesla announced that it would sell battery packs for residential energy storage at $200 per kilowatt hour, and that's even lower than the best curve on the upper panel. So electric cars will win on price eventually. This is an analysis made by Bloomberg this year. Let you focus on the trend. So you better start thinking about those that have internal combustion engine vehicles, start planning for an electric vehicle. But in the United States, the discussion is about electric cars. In Latin America, it should be about electric buses and electric trucks. That's where most of the energy demand of transport is focused. And we have made a similar analysis for levelized cost of equivalent transport energy requirements for cars, for buses, for trucks, and according to our estimates, you see the same situation. We're using learning curves, and we're using the trends that you saw in the previous picture, and a few other assumptions, including a reduction in total power demand associated with zero carbon grid. Two more points to finalize, very important points that sometimes fall off the edge of the debate. Moving the transport sector to full electric mode is the most important energy saving measure that Latin America can undertake. Because electric engines are much more efficient than internal combustion engines, we have estimated the total energy savings from full transport electrification, and according to our numbers, by 2050, just the savings of moving to full electric transport would equal 200% of the current power demand for electricity. This is a significant benefit. And finally, one more thing that is rarely discussed, and that is the complementarity of electricity and transport on the load curves. This is a typical load curve of power demand in Colombia. So that's 1 a.m. and midnight on the right side, 1 a.m. on the left, midnight on the right. You can see that there is a peak between 7 and 9 p.m. That's where all Colombians are consuming a lot of power, and most Colombians are sleeping at 3 a.m. That's not a surprise. But this type of curve is not ideal. It's common, but it's not ideal because it forces the system to expand based on the peak demands, which happens to be at 7 or 9 p.m. If you could have a more stable load curve, the system would operate at lower cost, more efficiently, and saving in expansion requirements. So I've made a calculation. What would happen if 50% of all diesel consumption in transport is displaced by power? And came out with an estimate of an additional demand per hour, nominal capacity requirement of 1,250 megawatts. Let's assume that that is concentrated in just 6 hours, while most Colombians are sleeping. That would be about 6 megawatts. Add that to the left side of the curve, and you would have a system that is much more stable, that would allow the power generators to benefit financially because they will be selling more energy with the same capacity that they have today. So in summary, a few thoughts as we discuss the added value of a zero greenhouse gas power sector or fully renewable power sector. The region would gain substantially on energy security. We discussed that point, inexhaustible renewable resources there every year on demand. It would help in improvements in terms of trade. Imagine countries in Latin America exporting zero carbon power to neighbors or even to North America. Improve air quality in urban areas. We didn't touch on that point, but electric transport would eliminate the emission of local airborne pollutants, which have been associated to significant economic costs in cities. Regional cooperation gains through the integration of the grid and means of transport. But more importantly, it would place the region on a path that is very consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals, which is the express policy objective of all countries in the region. It would support the deployment of new means of production. We are not asking people to change their quality of life. We are changing the means of production to maintain that quality of life, to improve it, for the foreseeable future, and it's not just a signal of leadership for the regional and climate arena. This is part of an ongoing effort. All the data that I've presented to you is part of an ongoing effort. A report on the regional, with a regional discussion has been published, but, and you have there the link. And we are working on deep dives for Chile and Peru. I'm very happy to interact with any or all of you who are interested on this topic. Thank you, Lisa.
Great, thank you. That was very interesting. Walter's presentation will be uploaded to our website in the next couple of days in case anybody wants to go back and look at all that great data. And I also want to mention, in case you haven't seen it since the issue of electric vehicles came up so much, we do have a report about electric transportation in Latin America available in the hall. So now we'll turn to Gabriela, and if you could talk about, maybe go into depth on some of the issues that Walter raised and talk about what you see as, I think Walter talked about a lot of opportunities, but I'd also like to hear what you see as the challenges and barriers to these issues.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And good morning, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here in the dialogue, Inter-American dialogue. Walter, thank you for the invitation. It's really great to be part of this distinguished panel. And I mean, I've read Walter's report with a lot of interest in the past, a couple of times actually. And I always make the joke that, in my institution, I'm from the World Bank, I work for the World Bank, that we always see two types of energy thinkers in the global practice of energy, people that is, focused on the trends, the status quo, and very focused on the conventional, traditional way of doing business. But then you have the visionaries, the people that is looking forward, that is pushing the envelope towards, inspiring new futures. And I always make the joke to Walter that he's in that second group. And it's very good because it's important to have a vision that's ambitious and that it's possible, but it's ambitious. And I think it's very important because policymakers need to know that it's possible to have a zero carbon power sector. And the question really, it's not whether it's possible, because it's, from a technological and economic point of view, it's absolutely possible. The question is really how and when, I think. And as Walter pointed out, there are a number of barriers. So in my few minutes of intervention, let me start by just generally discussing the energy balance of Latin America, because I think it's important to go a little bit beyond electricity to understand the challenges. Well, first of all, I think on the positive side, Latin America has evolved in energy, in primary energy, in a way that is incredible from so many perspectives. First of all, there has been a gradual decarbonization of primary energy mix, and also consumption. It almost goes hands, and the primary energy and final consumption are not the same, but the trends are very similar. So Latin America has decarbonized. It's substituted a large amount and share of oil production and generation, has substituted this for natural gas, which is great because it's really going decarbonizing in a fantastic way. The second thing that is interesting about Latin America is that the share of renewable energy in general, including all renewables, it's actually lower with time. But there is a reason for that. It's because there is a large portion of solid biomass, which is, as you know, linked to traditional uses of biomass and linked to deforestation and the use of, and issues with indoor pollution in the poor houses of a number of countries in Latin America. That has lowered with time. And this is great, because as Latin America increases access, which is one of the big successes of the region, after what developed countries have done, the trend is very clear, that there is less use of traditional biomass, and therefore the share of renewables in the total primary mix and in consumption has lowered. So this is great. Modern renewables, on the other hand, have increased gradually. There is a high reliance, as you know, on hydropower and biofuels, and non-conventional renewables are starting to take off. So this is the second thing interesting about Latin America, it's really increasing its access agenda, which is also very important for the renewables agenda, by the way. And the third and interesting trend in Latin America is that even though Latin America, until very recently, had not decoupled energy consumption from economic growth, in the last SE for All study, the global tracking framework that was just released a month ago, they report actually that there is an accelerating decoupling, which is very interesting because it means that economic activity and energy production is really going in the right direction, and that potentially, possibly, energy efficiency is starting to take off. So I think this is very positive. No? Another positive side of Latin America, and the reason why I agree with Walter in that Latin America is uniquely positioned to go zero carbon, is the fact that Latin America has experienced and pioneered electricity markets. And not all markets are functional, not all markets have been, perfect. And even some markets in Latin America have reversed. I mean, we saw that in, Bolivia, we saw it in Argentina. But Latin American, most of the markets in the continent, not so much in the Caribbean, most of the countries have electricity markets that are more or less functional, and a few of them are actually quite sophisticated. No? In the process of, let's say, structuring these markets, Latin America not only has learned a lot about how to, operate demand supply, in real terms, but it has also delivered a number of innovations on the policy and regulatory sides. No? So we do have sophisticated institutions, sophisticated regulators, and I think this is very important consideration when you think of a future that's, zero carbon, because for zero carbon you need a great deal of sophistication, and I'm going to get into that in a minute. No? Now, gas markets have not evolved as electricity markets in Latin America. Gas markets are really not very functional, and there is only few that have actually thrived. No? But Latin America is increasingly importing natural gas through LNG markets. And in reality, this is growing in an incredible way in Latin America, LNG trade. No? And this is actually projected to increase. I don't know if we can say this fortunately or unfortunately, but it's projected to increase because in a few years, Latin America with the fields, the Vaca Muerta field and other fields in Mexico, plus what's imported from the United States, it's going to continue using natural gas. No? Now, some people talk about natural gas as a systems fuels because the systems fuel, no? Because it's going to allow variable renewables to integrate. But it's not the only solution, it's true, and hopefully with time, it'll be only a temporary solution for Latin America. Latin America cannot go to zero carbon in electricity tomorrow because it's going to require a number of measures that are going to take time to establish. But natural gas is there and it's actually increasing, and it's important to keep this in mind. No? Now, this is a context I wanted to put in the table because it's important to see what are the trends, no, and what's going on with markets in the region. Now, there are a number of challenges. Walter mentioned many of them. To me, I mean, obviously, energy subsidies continue to be a great challenge. The fact that non-conventional renewables are still starting to take off, no? I mean, in final consumption, actually in electricity output, less than 2% is wind, geothermal, and solar, no? Which is, small. And hydropower is an issue, no? Because hydropower is increasingly affected by Niño events and weather variability, etc. And this is actually creating a problem in electricity because the electricity matrix is actually carbonizing. We are seeing a higher share of fossil fuel and a lower share of hydropower with time. So that's why it's so important to increase non-conventional renewables, given the amount of resources, as Walter just pointed out, in the region, no? Solar, wind, etc. We have abundant indigenous resources that need to come into, need to be realized. And that's very important. Plus the fact that Walter, in the Atacama Desert, in addition to the huge solar insulation, we have lithium. No, we have, I think, 50% of the reserves of, I read an article in The Economist a couple of days ago, and I was thinking, oh my God, in the same area, you have the sun and you have lithium for batteries, no? So it's quite remarkable. So we need to go that way, no? And another challenge really is connectivity. because renewable energy requires regional integration. And it really, the benefits, the value of renewables is exponential increase with regional integration. The issue we have in Latin America really is that we are not using the existing infrastructure. We are underutilizing the existing infrastructure, meaning we are not exchanging electrons. No? We are not doing it in Central America to the extent that we could. We are not doing it in the Andean countries, and we are barely doing it in South America. So this is an issue because we need to continue using what we have. No? So those are the general challenges. No? And I think, there are so many things we can do, and I think Latin America is prepared for that. No? But if I could, summarize or list, I think, the number of things that needs to be done, and that's the reason why I think going to a zero carbon is going to take us some time. It's that basically I think Latin America needs to plan better. And planning means really considering the basket of supply and demand side resources. Walter, you put this graph on the load curve and how transport affects the load curve, no? And it's very important because consumption is going to change dramatically. And I don't know if you probably have heard and have read everywhere that a disruption is approaching, no? This combination of technologies, batteries and solar PV and storage, smart grids, the digital revolution, the clean energy revolution, no? And actually, the clean energy and digital revolution makes economic sense, no? Because it's going to allow the supply chain of the energy sector, I mean, from production to consumption, including electricity, is going to increase efficiency. So technology is at the heart of the revolution, and technology is at the heart of the zero carbon. But this technology alone will not make a paradigm shift. You need the policies, you need the regulations, you need a number of strategies to actually make this happen. So planning strategically, I think, is going to be very important. The next generation of markets will have to develop the retail side, vibrant retail markets, because without consumers that understand, that are dynamic and that can trade products on the demand side, you cannot really realize this vision. No? And perhaps the elephant in the room for Latin America, and I finish my intervention with this, is the issue of governance. And this is really the kind of lost link, no, in Latin America. Despite the fact that we have very sophisticated institutions and regulators, the issue with governance, in my opinion, is the dimension of coordination and agility. If institutions are not agile, they will continue investing in large infrastructure on the demand side, large transmission and distribution, and without considering the huge resources on the demand side and renewables and distributed generation and the new technology. So planning strategically, considering consumers, multi-sectorial links, transport, water and energy, transport and energy, etc. And the fact that the consumer is not inelastic, the consumer is going to be very dynamic. Without that, it will be very difficult that we realize this vision. But I think Latin America is in the right direction for that and well positioned for a zero carbon.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think you pointed out a lot of the challenges. I mean, the vulnerability from climate change to hydro, and I might add to that, the social and environmental opposition to hydro has also stopped a lot of projects that might have gone through otherwise. And then the issue of the continuing need for natural gas, for reliable sources to complement intermittent energy, given the way that systems are set up right now. The lack of integration and the need to do more on the policy framework and governance side. So Samantha, go ahead.
So I'm gonna have to get right on top of this thing. I don't have much of a voice right now. So I'm gonna go from, we've talked about the very specific earlier. Is it picking this up actually? Okay. So we've talked about, oh, there it goes. That's much better. So we've been talking about the very specific to Latin America, and I'm actually here. I work on a global basis on global energy markets and global climate change issues. And so I'm going to take it back up to the 35,000-foot level and talk about the issue of deep decarbonization and also with respect to the Paris Agreement. So an important place to start this discussion, and the reason why we're having this discussion this morning, is the absolute centrality of the power sector to reaching Paris goals and any any scenario that has us dealing with climate change in a way that's acceptable. The Paris goal is extremely ambitious. Keeping climate change to less than 2 degrees C, below pre-industrial levels, is a very ambitious goal. And we need to get all the way to net zero emissions before the end of the century, and likely sooner, depending on how quickly we emit here up front. And so starting with the power sector is absolutely crucial, and that's why we're having this discussion this morning. Part of the reason why we start with the power sector is that there are a number of zero carbon technologies that we're using right now, not just the wind and solar that you hear about, but also nuclear, geothermal, hydroelectric. And so there are numerous technologies in use right now, which makes the power sector a good place to start. But also any scenario that looks at deep decarbonization, by the end of the century or sooner, you really have to think about electrifying additional sectors. We talked a lot about transportation, and that's absolutely necessary. But you also go all the way to electrifying process heat and the kinds of things that we use combustion for now. We really need to get away from combustion by the end of the century or sooner in most applications in order to reach a Paris kind of goal. So Paris set a clear and a very ambitious goal for climate change, but it didn't really talk about the how. It doesn't talk about a global carbon emissions budget. It doesn't talk about how to divvy up that budget. It doesn't talk about technology transfer or finance. And that's not really a bug of the Paris Agreement, it's more of a feature. And the reason why this happened was that previous climate negotiations had gotten really bogged down in arguing over responsibility for past emissions, who was going to be responsible for cutting emissions more now. And so the Paris process avoided this by allowing each country to bring its own emissions reductions, and for those national emissions reductions plans to become more ambitious over time. But the process leaves a lot of questions going forward, and the commitments that folks brought to the Paris Accord aren't nearly enough to get us to the 2 degree C goal. So we have a really long way to go still, and that's the kind of things that we're talking about in terms of Latin America this morning. Another thing that the other speakers have alluded to that I'd just like to bring up briefly is the level of challenge involved with electrifying and decarbonizing various sectors of the economy. And I really see two sides of this debate, and or two far sides of this debate, and I actually find them both a bit scary. On the one far side of the debate is a group of people who think that the process of decarbonizing will be economically crippling. It's a futile effort with uncertain benefits in the future. And I think we've seen that with the US response to pulling out of the Paris Agreement. But I'm in good company in seeing another side to the debate that I also find worrisome, and that's the side of the debate who says decarbonization is easy and inexpensive, and we could do it now if not for vested interests. I completely agree that fossil fuel subsidies are a problem, that we definitely need to price carbon and price in the externalities of carbon emissions and potential climate change in the future. But we definitely have to focus on the real challenges and not think about, oh, this is easy, renewables are cheap, and we're there. We just have to have the will. There are genuine technological challenges that we need to face. And I've been in this industry for about 20 years, and so I definitely see that side that says it's easy and cheap, and if it weren't for the oil industry, we'd be there. I find that frightening too. But one of these challenges that you hear the most about is intermittency, and both speakers have talked about that a little bit. And I mean, unlike combustion, wind and solar they don't produce power on demand. They're available when it's windy or when it's sunny. And a unique feature of power systems in the energy system is that you have to, at all times, instantaneously balance supply and demand. And so where you're thinking about a market, that's a very unique market that they have to instantaneously balance at all times or the grid collapses. And it's something you have to think about all the time with respect to setting up a power system. And there are a number of ways you can overcome this. We've talked a bit about using natural gas to balance out. Natural gas works well for that because it's quite flexible. It's very able to respond quickly in terms of changes and fluctuations in demand. But if we want to get to a truly decarbonized power system, we need to get away from combustion, at least without carbon capture and storage, which is a technology we haven't really talked about this morning. there's a dark side to every cloud. CCS is possible. It's also quite expensive right now. You really need a price signal to make it happen. And you also have the issue of parasitic load. It takes energy to pull the carbon out and sequester it. So you're burning more of your fossil fuel, coal or natural gas, in order to make the carbon sequestration work. Nuclear power is a zero carbon option. However, and it does run all the time, but it's not a great response to fluctuating demand. And so that's a challenge with nuclear. Batteries. We've heard talk about battery technology this morning. Batteries are definitely getting better. I entirely agree with the graphs that you've shown. However, they're still quite expensive for full grid scale storage. We're definitely getting to the point where they're becoming more cost effective for electric vehicles, for home systems like you're seeing Tesla marketing right now. But for true grid scale storage to, say, make up for the drop off when the sun goes down and solar goes offline is a bit more challenging. And there are a lot of people looking at new battery chemistries beyond lithium ion that might allow us to have lighter and more energy dense batteries. And for the lab or the people who crack this nut, there's a tremendous award for both monetarily and environmentally for cracking the nut towards a better battery. But as both speakers have talked about, hydropower is really an interesting pair for renewables. Dams are essentially batteries. They're very large energy storage systems where you can trade the potential energy of water and altitude for electricity. So Latin America has a real advantage in this area where they can potentially run their dam system to balance out their renewables and even potentially run the dams in reverse, something we call pumped storage, that when you have excess renewable power generation, you can pump water back up and run it through the dam during times of lower demand. But the trick here is that dams are run for a lot of reasons other than hydroelectric production. They're run for flood control. They're run for recreational purposes, perhaps. They need to send the water through the dams in a way that is okay for downstream aquatic life. And so we need to think about the limitations of running dams just to balance out renewable power. We also need to think about weather events that may become stronger with climate change and also potential El Nino events or potential drier or wetter seasons that may happen due to climate change. Something that's come up this morning, but maybe not quite so specifically, is when you really think about a power system built around intermittent renewables, that power system has a different shape than the power system we have today. Right now, what we do is we tend to build our power systems and our power plants close to load centers, cities or large industrial properties. And we move the fuel. We move natural gas or we move coal. Nuclear doesn't involve moving fuel around, but again, we tend to build those sites near load centers. Whereas when you think about a system based on renewables, the resource is where it is. You can't move it. You have solar in the Atacama Desert. You have wind in northern Colombia. You have good dam sites where they are. And so you have to think about a system that doesn't move fuel. It moves power. And Gabriela alluded very well to the need for a more integrated power system in a high renewables world, in a zero carbon world. You have to think about building a lot more long distance transmission lines because you can no longer build those power plants right next to the city. They have to go where the resource is. And so a potential thing to think about, and something that I don't really hear enough thought about in zero carbon systems, is this need for a very integrated grid system and how the integrated grid system that you might need in a renewable world compares to the more city-centric move the fuel system that many countries have in place now. So I could talk about a number of other factors that different speakers have alluded to or that I haven't heard. We can talk about the role of natural gas. Is it a bridge or is it a dead end? We could talk about market systems and the need for liberalization and how that's playing out in certain countries, such as Mexico. We could also talk about how to manage grid stability in a zero carbon world. The spin of turbines in gas or coal-powered plants actually provide a bit of grid stability. And you can do that in a zero carbon system, but it takes some technology and some thought. There's more to the grid than just the cents per kilowatt hour that's generated. So we can talk about any number of things, but I think I'll save them for the question and answer. But I'm happy to take any questions on these and other topics. And I don't want to sound negative or in any way questioning that zero carbon world, but I want us all to acknowledge the challenge that exists so we can take them head on and really think about how to get through them. Thanks.
Great, thank you. That was very interesting. Well, I have a couple of questions, but I want to give the audience a chance to ask their questions. Maybe I'll add mine on. So I'll take a group, and please state your name and affiliation before asking your question. You had a question over here?
Yes, my name is. Thank you. My name is Laura Hills. I'm with Hills, Stern and Morley, a law firm. I have a question about financing these things. So when I look at the picture of the Atacama Desert, which is an extraordinary resource, I also think about the solar farms that were brought online a couple years ago. And as those solar farms came online in the merchant context, it drove the price down so low that those projects are now, per kilowatt hour that is, that those projects are now at risk, and they present a real financing challenge in that environment. So my question really is, how do you deal with that? And is the only solution back to a long-term power purchase agreement with a fixed price? That is a subsidy, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Christine.
Hi, I'm Christine Penzich from the LAC Bureau of USAID, and I had a comment to start with, but then also a question. The first comment is that I had a chance to travel in February to Colombia with colleagues from the National Renewable Energy Lab, who gave us sort of an ongoing tutorial in grid integration of renewables, and made a very clear and well-substantiated point, these are hard-nosed physicists, that up to 30% integration of renewables is very feasible now, even without heavy battery investment, and based almost entirely on how you operate your system. The key assumption there is that you have a fairly large network of solar or wind turbines, which smooths out the intermittency just by itself, but also a variety of other ways that you can manage your system voltage, frequency, and other, sort of ancillary services. This is being done in Denmark, which is, of course, very highly interconnected with neighboring countries, but also in Portugal, which is analogous to an island in terms of its electric system. So up to 30% integration is kind of not an issue. There's experience, and it can be done, and that's a very substantial accomplishment now. And that's a little bit to Samantha's cautions, which are very true, but there are real, sort of progress is also very possible. The question I have, actually, the second point is, I'm a little bit surprised that the panel members haven't touched a bit more on the political economy of fossil fuels versus renewables. This is important at many levels. In Costa Rica, the bus system in San Jose is a network of, like 5 monopolies of a basically very disorderly system, which everybody agrees has problems, but they cannot negotiate, despite great efforts, a more sort of coherent system with these owners. In Colombia, the mining interests are promoting, they want to sell the coal, they want to sell the oil. It's an exceptionally diversified energy base in that country. In Brazil, anybody who's been following the country for the last 3 years knows how deeply fossil fuel interests are tied in with governance. So I'm curious about that and how you see the prospects for overcoming those barriers. I think that is really something that needs to be cracked, despite the eye-popping low prices that are coming up.
Thank you. Great questions. And I'll add one, and then we can go down the line and then take another set. I was wondering if any of the panelists could talk more about distributed power. So, Walter, you mentioned it very briefly, but I'm wondering how much is there a need to expand distributed power or any type of decentralized electricity system or mini grids? Is this something that needs to happen on a huge scale, or are we just talking about, a little bit here and there? So, we'll just go down the line. You can answer any of the questions that you like.
Okay. On the grid integration, I did indicate in one of the slides that this is very important to integrate the grid. The system today is an island system. There are a few countries that have cross-boundary connections, but it's an island system. And that leads to inefficiencies in operation and higher costs. There are $4.2 billion in projects in grid integration. And if they go forward, the level of connectivity between the different national grids will be vastly improved. The main barrier is not technological. The systems talk to each other. There are no different technologies between Peru and Colombia in terms of grid management. The barrier is the political economy, because the levels of pricing in one country are different from the others. There is a resistance to integrate. One of the more important cases is Central America and Colombia. Colombia is a low-cost carbon, low-carbon, low-cost power producer. It could displace many high-cost, high-carbon producers in Central America, and clearly there is a resistance there. I did talk about the fossil fuel subsidies. They are substantial, and they are a major barrier also for progress. But I want to address the issue of distributed power and of intermittencies. In 2013, when I was at IDB, we tried very hard to sell a concentrated solar power with storage in the Atacama Desert. And the IDB was willing to put some money up front, some subsidies through the CIF, and there was a tremendous resistance. That was in 2013. Guess what? 2017, that plant is being built with storage. So these criticisms that are partly true, that the intermittency is there for renewables, is being addressed. Concentrated solar power can be firm capacity. And in a few months, we'll see the largest power plant, concentrated solar power storage facility in Latin America coming into stream in Chile. On distributed power, and I will let others discuss the other points, this is a very important part of the equation. There are countries that have already regulations on distributed power, like Mexico, like Chile, and others are moving in that direction. Distributed power allows the demand and the supply to be in the same site. And because we live in Latin America, there is a substantial radiation field, this is a major part of the solution. I see in the future, with the right regulations in place, and already seeing the evidence of that, that distributed power will supply a substantial fraction of the energy supply. I could talk about the others, but maybe later.
Percentage-wise, do you have any numbers?
Of distributed power today is very small, but look, I was flying from Barranquilla to Panama City the other day, and I was surprised. It was a clear day. I was surprised to see so many solar roofs. And a few years back, photovoltaics, that's science fiction. And this is one lesson for us. This technology is not idle, and the political climate is not idle. And I think we need to push it. We need to push the debate forward, but we have to call natural gas for its right name. Natural gas is not a solution compatible with a low zero carbon. 3% of fugitive emissions from natural gas, which in Latin America I can see that happening, is more carbon intensive than coal. So we have to call this and call the politicians that are arguing for liquefied natural gas and for natural gas in Latin America and say, well, we have to call it by the right name.
I'll take a couple of those questions. The question about solar power driving prices down in a market is a particularly interesting one. And I don't know the case of the Atacama Desert project, but I do know probably an even more extreme case, which is what you see in California, particularly Southern California, with respect to power prices during days when there's a lot of solar. And very sunny days in Southern California will actually push wholesale power prices in their market below zero. That is literally a situation where companies are paying people to take their power away. That's what happens when it gets very sunny. And this is something that you need to think about if you have a lot of solar photovoltaic on your system. whether you back that up with another resource in order to make it firm, and then you can sell it. You could back that up. Perhaps if there's hydro on your system, you could think about putting together a contract that will allow you to do that. Another thing that Walter had mentioned that I completely agree with is if you build concentrating solar power, you can build storage into that. It's typically done with molten salt. And that allows that power also to be sold on a firm basis and allows that power to better match up with the peak power that you saw in the graph that he displayed that actually happens right after sundown. It was like 7 to 9 p.m. If you can shift your solar from that time from when the sun goes down to when everybody comes home and turns on their lights, turns on the television, if you can shift that power production or through storage, then you'd have fewer problems with the problems that solar can cause in power markets. I completely agree with your point on the 30% grid integration being relatively easy with current technology. I'm in full agreement with that. You run into more challenges when you start going to a truly zero carbon system, particularly a system that has less hydro. Then you run into more problems with intermittency, with grid stability, things like grid inertia and keeping the voltage up. But that 30% number, I'm in total agree with, and NREL does terrific work. One more thought on the distributed power question. We're definitely seeing more distributed power around, and something to think about is how it affects a utility business model as there becomes more and more of it. When you think about this in terms of where a utility sits, and that utility has to maintain its grid system. Most of these folks who have solar powers on their roof are still connected to the grid. They'll take in power when they need it and sell back when they need it. But the utility has to spread out the cost of maintaining that grid over fewer power sales. And so utilities in Latin America, if they start to see a lot of grid-connected distributed generation, really have to think about their business model and think about perhaps separating a service charge versus a power charge, and really think about how they charge for the electricity that they provide in order to continue to be able to maintain their systems with more distributed power. On like a mini grid, off grid kind of application, it's all good. And it's all good. And it's a good development when you have it in a grid system too, but you have to that utility really needs to think about their business model and how to continue to provide reliable service if there's a lot of distributed on the grid.
And I think the policy to get around that is decoupling profits from sales, but I think in most Latin American countries you don't have decoupling, so you don't really have the right incentives for utilities.
Yeah, and utilities in the States are still struggling with that. So I think there's a lot to learn both on the wild fluctuations in wholesale power prices when there's a lot of solar and the how to deal with distributed generation. We're struggling with that now here.
Now, just to add, my colleagues address most of these interesting questions. I agree, on the distributed generation side. It's going to be an issue first for regulators and it's been an issue in the United States, in California and the Northeast markets, as well as in Europe. You need to have very refined, granular regulation to be able, even intraday markets, to be able, time of use tariffs, to be able to have a vibrant retail market on the distributed side. But this is possible, And I think utilities need to plan for this because the technology is there. Batteries, as Walter pointed out before, and storage is going to be a reality very soon. And as soon as you have a storage, then there is a whole new equation and panorama there, Where utilities really, if they don't join the business, they are going to lose it. Because, that's why, people are talking about disrupted utilities, Utilities, need to pay for their assets. And if they lose customers, how can they pay for those assets? These will be stranded or sink assets. And this has to be planned. I think 100% distributed is not a reality now or soon, but it'll definitely happen because the technology, digital communications technologies and clean energy will be there. If not, they are already there very soon. And I also wanted to bring this idea to the table as well, the fact that when we compare developing energy markets in developing countries with energy markets in developed countries, we need to be careful, because in developing economies, and certainly in Latin America, energy demand is growing at very high rates. And whereas in developed countries, Europe, for instance, the demand growth rates are, if not flat, negative. And so this makes a complete different way of looking at planning with renewables and renewables integration and the, the future, no? As well as, considering the resources that you have in Europe and Latin America. No? So comparing markets, I think, is very dangerous. But I think for the clean energy vision, it's important to say that for high-growing energy markets, the panorama is completely different. No? And I mean, I take you to the primary third, the climate change issue, which is one of the huge problems of our time, will put you enormous pressure, even in policymakers in Latin America, where we have, perhaps not the most. We don't. I mean, our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions is minuscule compared to India, China, and developed economies. No? But nevertheless, the pressure is very high. And I think that carbon trading, carbon emissions trading, carbon taxes, they will play a key role. Externality pricing is important. I see, Mexico and the Chileans have introduced, mechanisms at the start on that direction. But that is happening. But, I mean, it's a very difficult thing because it's really more about politics and it's always very uncertain. But I think that international politics in climate change are putting huge pressure on governments. So I guess that's the path, no?
Thank you. Okay, we can take more questions. Liana.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentations. My name is Liliana, and I am here representing my school, SAIS, Johns Hopkins SAIS. I have a question about concerns of energy security, because a lot of the renewables potential will be magnified if the grids are integrated. But countries seem to be very cautious about integration and not being able to manage their own grid or depend on somebody else's grid. That's one question. And the other question is about the political economy of gas in Latin America and the fact that it is being pushed as a very cost-effective solution. And for example, in Brazil, which has a very small gas market in its infancy with great potential to grow, how is that renewables are going to compete with this vested interest to push gas? And gas integrates easily with the system right now. It's cheap.
Thank you. Any other questions? Over here.
Thank you. I am Antonio Meirelles with the Brazil Industries Coalition. And my question, of course, is regarding Brazil. With the scale that Brazil has compared to other Latin American countries and also its experience with energy distribution and with the clean and diverse energy matrix, which role do you think it could play in this process and also in integrating Latin America energy infrastructure? And as we also saw that 10 years ago, the country could transform its transportation system by including ethanol as one fuel and has many other experience in the clean energy field that could serve as an example for other countries with the same scale, which is an issue in the energy sector. So, thank you.
Any other questions? Over here.
Thank you. Maria Lucia Mendiola from the Embassy of Peru. I would like to hear more about the storage technologies available for the renewable energies, because I think we haven't heard a lot of that.
Sorry, which technologies?
The storage technologies available.
We could take one more if there's another one. Okay.
Guy Edwards, Brown University. Thanks very much to all the panelists. I had a quick question about fossil fuel subsidy reform and which countries in the region are actually making progress.
Okay, and maybe if you could be brief, we could have time for one more round. So let's just go in the same order.
Okay, great questions, all of them. Let me preface what I'm going to say by stating the evident. This is not easy. It's not going to be easy, but it's necessary. As Gabriela said, there are no alternatives. We have to move to zero carbon at some point. Your point, Mr. Miralles, is excellent. And let me tell you about the experience of Uruguay and southern Brazil. And you've heard about that. Uruguay stated at COP in Paris that they are going to be zero carbon power, and they are there. They are at zero carbon power. How did they do it? They couldn't do it by themselves. They did it through integration with southern Brazil. So southern Brazil, Brazil has to take some credit in allowing a regional economy, one of the most advanced in the region socially, to become a zero carbon society. There are other countries that have stated in clear terms, I'm going there. It's difficult, but I'm going there. Nicaragua. Nicaragua has said, I'm going zero carbon, and they are moving very fast with wind energy and integrated with hydro. Costa Rica has indicated it will go zero carbon. Chile is now restating its goals, more ambitious. We're going toward there. They are not set zero carbon, very close to it. So the experience of Brazil, in particular for South America, is very important because you have a significant fraction of that fraction of a terawatt in energy storage in the hydro plants. It's a fantastic battery that is there for, not just for the taking, because grid integration needs to take place, but if we can, as I said during the presentation, if we can integrate those 92 gigawatts of multi-annual reservoirs, it will reduce the cost and will allow more intermittent renewables to come into the grid. On the political economy of gas, very quickly, yeah, this is such a difficult and current topic, very difficult. And I've seen evidence that natural gas is being pushed from all quarters, Central America, but the United States, no, let's be clear, pushing gas. And there are significant reservoirs of gas in Latin America. And people say, well, this is our resource and we don't want it to be stranded. Let's move forward with it. All that is true. But my simple answer is, sorry, in our future, no room for natural gas. I'm very sorry, but that's the case. For reaching a stable climate, we need to move to zero carbon. And Latin America is in a pole position to do it. It will be difficult, and people will react to it. And the oil interest in Latin America will react to it. But the economics and the technology and the resources available are showing us the way to go. Very quickly on the technology for storage. So there has been a continuous criticism that these are intermittent technologies and resources, and we cannot rely on them for firm capacity. But the Cerro Dominador plant in Chile is being installed with storage. It will be a 24-hour facility. It will be one of the largest CSP plants. And it's good that it's taking place in Atacama because it will show in practice what the studies and forecasts have said, that this is very competitive even with storage. Of course, there's a particular market there is addressing the needs of the mining industry. Mining not as in oil and gas mining, but minerals. But that experience will document and will drive the curve down for supply of firm capacity using renewable energy. Let me stop there.
Thanks. I'll just address a couple of the questions, and I will try to be brief. On the energy security question and the integrated grids, I'm in complete agreement that that's going to be a real challenge. On the other hand, I mean, countries involved are going to have to do a cost-benefit analysis. As Walter has pointed out, the tremendous hydro capacity in Latin America can make the zero carbon transition a lot easier. There's real potential there to pair intermittent renewables with hydro to get much, much closer to a zero carbon system. And countries are just going to have to take that into account and say, what are we willing to trade off? How much do we want to go to zero? How much easier does this make it for us? That's, I'm very much minimalizing a very important political problem, but when the rubber meets the road, that's what it comes down to. The other question that I'm probably best positioned to answer is the storage technology question that came from over here. We've heard a lot about batteries in this conversation, but something we haven't talked about much is the potential to use electric vehicles when they're plugged in as storage mechanisms. You hear about that a little bit, where they can actually take power from the grid and feed it back when it's needed, when they're parked, which frankly most of our cars are most of the time. And so that's something we haven't talked about this morning, which is something that can be used if you get, smart cars, smart grid technology that enables that to happen. So there could be a lot of parked storage out there that could be helpful. Walter spoke a little bit about concentrated solar power. Unlike photovoltaics that make electricity directly from sunlight, concentrated solar power makes heat, and then that heat is used to generate electricity. And so you can store that heat, usually in terms of molten salt or some other phase change material. And so that's a storage technology specific to solar that can work quite well. A couple other technologies that are out there that we haven't really talked about yet. Geothermal storage, basically storing heat underground. There's also additional phase change materials. There tends to be a lot of energy put in and released, say when ice melts or freezes, and you can work with various phase change materials to use them to store energy. That technology has a ways to go, but it's definitely being considered right now.
I mean, my colleagues addressed most of the questions. I just like to make a final remark. That I think that this question about whether gas is there, is competitive, full, zero carbon renewables. I mean, there is a number of resources on the demand and the supply side that can be used to deliver a zero carbon, to be honest. There is a number of technologies like electric vehicles, there are a range of storage technologies, even hydro reservoirs that can be used as storage. So in specific circumstances, it's very possible, South America, etc., to basically use your resources to deliver what you want to do from the policy point of view. If your policy in Costa Rica is zero carbon, they will definitely be able to do it because they have a large hydro and abundant resources. Same with Brazil, no? It is a question of policy, but I think from the technology point of view, the planning point of view, the tools, the technologies, it's true, and I agree that it's possible. Now, there is a political economy of fossil fuels, which is another issue, but from the economic and technological point of view, zero carbon is possible. Now, how this is going to evolve depends on various different, things. And fossil fuel subsidies still, play an important role. Somebody mentioned what is the status of, fossil fuel policy, fossil fuel subsidy reform, no? And to be honest, I think Latin America, this has been a little bit slow. I mean, today, I believe 0.89% of GDP aggregated in Latin America is fossil fuels, which is about 14, 16 times larger than in advanced economies. So we still have, I mean, of course, it's much lower than in many countries in Middle East and other, very, subsidy countries with a lot of subsidies, but still we are not close to the global best practice. And there is a long way to go in subsidies. Mexico, Chile, other countries have advanced on this front, but this is still one of the things that we need to address. No? But ultimately, what matters is that the resources are there, the technologies are there, the possibility to go zero carbon is there, and it's only a matter for countries to decide whether to do it. Central America, for instance, have actually phased out oil generation dramatically. Why? Because they are very dependent on oil, and it's, every time there is an oil price shock, they are vulnerable. The whole economy is in this rain, no? So they've actually added, of the sub-regions of Latin America, Central America have added the most amount of non-conventional renewables. And Nicaragua is pretty remarkable, I agree with Walter. Nicaragua, investment, public and private investment as a percent of gross national product, gross domestic product, is one of the highest in the world. I mean, they've gone really the long way. Same with Costa Rica and other countries. So I think the main issue is countries are progressing towards that kind of future. The Chilean energy 2050 policy is amazingly ambitious, no? They say they're going to have 60% renewables by 2030, something like that. I don't remember very, very well, but it's very ambitious. So my point is, Latin America is very ambitious in its let's say, clean energy future, no? And I think I believe that natural gas will play a role. I don't deny this. I think it's going to play a role in the years to come. But at some point, the technologies will be there, will be cheap, the logarithmic technologies, and natural gas will basically not necessarily be needed. No? So those are my.
Thank you. Well, we're getting close to time, so to avoid going over, I think I'll end it here. But just to mention a few things that we're doing at the dialogue, in addition to the electric vehicles report, I mentioned the issue of technology has obviously come up a lot in this discussion. And we have a report out in the hall on clean energy innovation, which looks at the need for technology development in Latin America and what's actually happening there. We also, in July, we have an event on clean power in Colombia. So it's sort of looking at these issues, but with a focus specifically on Colombia. It's going to be in Bogota, but you can look out for our analysis coming out of that. And then we also have a conference on clean transportation and electric vehicles in Costa Rica on September 20th. It's going to be recorded, so even if you're not able to go, you'll be able to watch the panels afterwards. So I want to thank you, all the speakers. This has been really interesting. I learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody has more questions, but maybe can ask you another time. Thank you.